Breaking news into HQ, one of the most accomplished and controversial athletes of the 20th century, Pete Rose, has died at the age of 83. The Clark County, Nevada medical examiner confirms to ABC News. Now, Rose is the all-time MLB hits leader and is a 17-time All-Star with the Reds, Phillies, and Expos. However, in 1989, Rose was banned from baseball after an investigation found that he bet on baseball while the manager for the Cincinnati Reds. For more, welcoming in former Major League Baseball executive David Samson. And David, I know this is a man you knew from the world of baseball. What are your initial reactions to Pete Rose's death?
It's a day that obviously everyone knew was coming, as it does for everybody, and it's been a topic of conversation within baseball circles for the 2 decades I was in baseball. As you know, he is not eligible to be in the Hall of Fame. It's all he ever wanted, and I was lucky enough to work with Tony Perez for 16 years, Pete Rose's teammate, who would tell stories about Pete and the type of player he was, the type of man he was, but always wondering why it is that they couldn't find a way to have a détente. And it's because Pete Rose was never actually willing to admit what happened, and then when he did, people thought it was too little too late. But I think today we should talk about and think about who he was as a player. And we're talking about one of the top 5 hitters in the history of baseball.
Absolutely, who he was as a player. And like you say, the Hall of Fame exists because it's filled with players you cannot tell the story of the sport without. And Pete Rose, of course, despite being banned from the sport in 1989, was still the all-time hits leader. 4,256 hits over his 24-season career, 17 All-Star Game nods, 3 World Series, NL MVP in 1973. When you look at the way that Major League Baseball has adjusted with the steroids era and such, do you think that post-mortem there might be some sort of way to honor the career and the contributions to the game?
Ironically, that's the one thing that Pete Rose never wanted. He didn't want it to happen after he died. He wanted to be a part of the Hall of Fame while he was alive. And it's something that I've spoken to the commissioner about many times, both Bud Selig and now Rob Manfred. And when Rob Manfred was becoming commissioner about a decade ago, the conversation was, is there a path for Pete Rose? How would it work? And remember when this started, Bart Giamatti was the commissioner who suspended Pete Rose and made him ineligible, and then he died very soon after, maybe within a week. And Bud Selig never wanted to reverse that in Bart Giamatti's honor. And then Rod Manfred never wanted to reverse it in Bud Selig's honor as well. The question is, does time heal? And my thought always has been, let a committee decide. Take him off the permanently ineligible list, and let's see what a committee would do, because he's not eligible with the writers any longer. And it's a tough decision because he violated the one rule you can't violate. You don't bet on baseball, and he clearly did that.
Absolutely. Affecting the integrity of the game is something that the league takes quite seriously. But when you look at a player who contributed so much on the diamond, Pete Rose, affectionately nicknamed Charlie Hustle, how will you remember his contributions to the game?
I'm so happy you asked that, because it's so hard when you get defined by something that happens off the field. And it happens to many athletes, it happens to many people. And if you ask generations of people, they'll say Pete Rose, the gambling guy, the guy who bet on baseball. But if you ask others, people who have been around baseball, they say that's a Hall of Fame player. He could hit like no one I've ever seen. The only player I've ever seen who can hit like Pete Rose is Ichiro, where you just have the ability to be one step ahead of pitchers at all times. One great story Tony Perez told me is that when Pete Rose needed a hit, he would just look at the bench when the team needed something, and he would say, I'm getting a hit. And then he would do it. And to make hitting look easy, it's almost impossible to do, because hitting to me is the hardest skill that exists in all of sports.
It's a hard skill to do, and he did it 4,256 times over 24 seasons. David, I know you've had many opportunities to interact with Pete Rose in your involvement with the game. Is there a personal story or a moment in which you had an interaction that's going to stick with you?
I would say the biggest one is when with Tony Perez, just wondering and talking about baseball. When you're with him, it wasn't a conversation about the Hall of Fame. It wasn't a conversation about gambling. It was this love of baseball and the camaraderie with the teammates who were on the Big Red Machine in the 70s, Tony Perez and obviously Pete Rose and Joe Morgan and Dave Concepcion. And they just had this camaraderie and this winning team philosophy, and it was just amazing to be around that sort of history, and that's what I'll remember. But of course the conversations are all going to be about the fact that he's suspended, about the fact that he gambled on baseball, about the fact what will MLB do now. And that's going to take over from the reality of Pete Rose as a pretty tragic figure in the history of our sport.
Absolutely, a tragic figure who contributed so much on the field to the game. When you look at the fact that he accomplished so much and his hits record that stands to this day, is there any chance that you see someone breaking Pete Rose's hits record?
I view that, along with 511 losses or 512 wins, as the most unbreakable records. Well, maybe Cal Ripken's Ironman record as well. There's certain records that you play the game, what can never be broken, and it is, do the math. Barely anyone gets 200 hits in a season. Imagine having a career where you have to do it for 21 seasons. It's almost impossible. My math could be wrong, but it may not be. But it doesn't matter. It's impossible to believe that someone could do that for as long and then approach that record.
David Samson, thank you so much for the time and the memories as we reflect on the life of Pete Rose, who died at 83.